Dreamworks animation. My god, how does a studio go from being so beloved to so hated in such a short time frame? I remember just a year ago, everyone was praising them to hell and back like they were the second coming of Christ, unable to do wrong and primed to take down the evil tyrants over at Disney. Everyone was on the bandwagon, and to the internet's credit, they didn't jump ship right away. I mean, normally in the face of this kind of sudden blind optimism, it would flicker out in a matter of days, but they kept that light burning through all of 2023, which in internet terms equates to like 2 decades more or less, so for a second, it did really seem as if Dreamworks was gonna stay in the people's good graces moving forward. But then something happened that stopped that momentum dead in its tracks. Awkwafina. And I guess the film she starred in, Kung Fu Panda 4, but I'll do anything to blame Awkwafina. We need to stop putting that woman in movies. But why Kung Fu Panda 4 out of all films? It's not like it was the first underwhelming Dreamworks film in the last year, and it's not like Kung Fu Panda 4 was that much worse in comparison. Granted, it is definitely the least appealing, so I can understand some healthy critique, but Dreamworks has always been a mixed bag, and it's far from the worst they've ever made, so why is the hate for this film so strong it could stop the positivity dead in its tracks? Well, to answer that question, first we have to look back at what started the hype train to begin with. That's right, we're gonna talk about Puss in Boots: The Last Wish, and I already know you're wondering, what's there left to say? It's been out for over a year now, and in that time, the cartoon community's milked it drier than Hollywood's milking Awkwafina. Yeah, 2 Awkwafina jabs so far, what's she gonna do about it? And you're right, pretty much everything that could be said about Last Wish has been said by people way smarter than me, and for good reason too. It's gorgeous, it's hilarious, it's thought-provoking, it's everything you could want out of an animated movie and a billion times more, but one thing I almost never hear people talk about when they mention Last Wish is that despite working so well as a self-contained story, it's also a sequel, specifically to the aptly titled Puss in Boots 2011, and if you know anything about that film, it isn't hard to see why. Not to say that 2011 is a bad movie per se, but it isn't exceptional either, and trust me, I would know. I'd actually thought about making a video on it way back in 2021 since I had fond memories and assumed it was underrated. But then when I went to take notes, I realized that while creative, its story and characters were so ceaselessly okay, I couldn't bring myself to write anything but a basic plot description. There just wasn't much to say, no meat, it was pure mid, and with how well Last Wish works by itself, sequel or no, what would be the point of bringing it up at all besides marveling at the fact such a great film could come from such humble beginnings? Is there really anything to take away from it as a continuation? And to that, I say yes. In fact, I don't think Last Wish starting the hype train and 4 ending it was a coincidence, as to me, 1 effectively uses all the key points DreamWorks tries to hit when making a sequel, while the other throws them out. And to clarify, when I say that, I don't mean there's a hard list of rules the company follows, at least to my knowledge. For all I know, they could be making unsavory deals with the underworld like Weird Al Yankovic, but regardless of how they do it, DreamWorks undeniably has a phenomenal track record with follow-ups, even if the original isn't that great. We're talking Shrek 2, How to Train Your Dragon 2, Kung Fu Panda 2, Madagascar 2, Croods 2, not one of them worse than their predecessor, many arguably better. It's an impressive track record if there ever was one. I mean, I guess there's Joseph King of Dreams and Megamind the Doom Syndicate, but those are basically TV movies, so they don't count. Also, Spirit Untamed is a thing, but that's a reboot. And there's Shrek the Third. Okay, it's not a perfect system, they don't always deliver bangers, but so far up to this point, no matter how bad a DreamWorks sequel has been, and that's an extremely rare scenario to start, they've always kept to one of a couple rules at all times. Rules that Kung Fu Panda 4, in its infinite wisdom, treats with about as much respect as Awkwafina's voice does for my eardrums. Oh yeah, 3 for 3, let's go! But before we get to why it failed so hard to the point it gave Twitter a world-ending aneurysm, you know, the fun stuff, let's take some time to establish what those rules are and how they've been used so effectively with 1 or 2 examples to illustrate each. The first of which, respecting the original but not relying on it, is perfectly handled by Last Wish. Now, like I said, the first Puss in Boots isn't exactly something to write home about. It's fine, and for the most part, you could disregard what it established going into a sequel. After all, his love interest, Kitty Softpaws, goes off to who knows where when everything's done, the main villains all die by the time it's over, and most importantly, it was a decade-old piece of mediocrity, so most people probably wouldn't complain if you switched it up. I didn't even bother with a spoiler warning because I knew you didn't care. Last Wish wasn't expected to stay true to its predecessor at all, but surprisingly, it does by looking at its most worthwhile bits and evolving them. For example, like the Shrek films it's based off of, Puss in Boots played a lot with fantasy tropes, basing its main story and characters on well-known fairy tales, so realizing the potential taking that concept further could have, it crosses over and gets amplified in Last Wish with the introduction of Jack Horner and Goldie and the Three Bears as new antagonists after the Wish Upon a Star. But then again, that's not quite unique to Last Wish in particular. You can excuse that as just staying in line with Shrek. But one element that actually does take direct inspiration from 2011 to build its own identity is the story's structure. That being as a race-to-the-finish heist film about Puss looking to get something back he lost before through the help of a magical item. In the first film, it was stealing the golden goose to save his reputation, which he's thoroughly regained at the start of Last Wish, and here, it's wishing for 8 new lives before death can collect his last. It's an intentionally repeated pattern used to both subtly point out how Puss doesn't change until the end of the film, and creates a motif that makes watching the two back-to-back extra satisfying. Plus, they give Puss a similar arc to the villain of the last film, Humpty, by making him reflect on his mistakes and give up the item he thought could fix his problems through a character he previously screwed over, so there's thematic consistency too. And what's so great about this narrative parallel is that it isn't in your face. If you're looking for plain references and callbacks as one of the 10 Puss in Boots 2011 fans, it's got you covered from Kitty to the mid-air boot clacking to that fucking ooh cat. There's obvious fan service if you want, but beyond that surface level, the whole film, while working just fine as its own thing and having clear differences, doesn't forget its roots and stays faithful without leaning on it too hard. Not that there's too much to lean on to begin with, but my point stands. They do a fantastic job integrating the nuances in a subtle way so that whether you pick up on the similarities or not, it doesn't feel like a totally disconnected experience. Last Wish is still a sequel to 2011, and it's not ashamed of that, quite the opposite. It revels in what came before by using the first as a basis to create something a cut above. The film justifies itself as a sequel by showing it respects the original and wants to do better. That's why you shouldn't forget that it's a continuation. Too many people worked too hard for you ungrateful bastards not to notice. They didn't have to be so nice to the source. They didn't have to make all these meaningful connections. They didn't have to deconstruct Puss's original goal by letting him achieve legendhood and not be happy. It was also fans of the franchise wouldn't feel something was missing. Though, really, that last bit's better suited for the next rule, developing characters and themes. A point I've established Last Wish handles well, but not quite as well as Kung Fu Panda 2 and 3, the older step-siblings of 4 that don't like to acknowledge they're related. And the reason I call them step-siblings is that although 4 is, well, called 4, implying it's the next logical step in the series, it feels completely out of place compared to the perfection of the original trifecta. That's why I feel the need to group them together. They're one of the few Dreamworks trilogies where every film wasn't just good, but gave the impression they were planned from the start, since the arc the main character goes through is so seamless and identifiable thanks to the film's consistent usage of themes, most prominently through its villains, who each represent a different part of Taoism, a Chinese philosophy and religion focused on finding inner peace. The first, Tai Lung, a jaded martial arts master denied a destiny he feels owed, represents and acts as a physical obstacle for the main character Po, a panda who gets the title Tai Lung trained for despite, at first, not knowing a lick of kung fu. That's the dilemma of the original film, Po trying to live up to the title as everyone looks down on him until he's able to see his own personal strengths to prove them wrong. It's a classic underdog story as a singular film, but in the greater scheme of the overarching plots, it's the first step to him fulfilling his spiritual journey, a test of the body. Following that in Kung Fu Panda 2, Po has to unknowingly face the genocider of his people, Lord Shen, a power-obsessed dictator who tried to subvert his destiny by by killing all the pandas before one was able to stop him. He's an absolutely ruthless tactician who creates the cannon to fight Kung Fu, putting Po at a disadvantage that's exacerbated by his unresolved trauma, forcing him to confront where he came from and letting the pain flow before finding the strength to win, overcoming a test of the mind. Finally, for the third film, Po's confronted by General Kai, a being from the spirit world out to steal every Kung Fu master's chi for himself. And unlike Tai Lung or Shen, it's not as simple as finding the strength or will to fight back. Kai's powers are more supernatural than that and require a chi master to beat, so after learning not all the pandas were wiped out, including his biological father, Po goes to a panda village, eventually discovering who he is after spending the film in turmoil over where he belongs, mastering chi through a combination of self-discovery and the help of everyone he's inspired. By reaching peace with himself and those around him, Po overcomes a test of spirit, completing the trifecta of inner peace and reaching a satisfying conclusion to his character. Every subsequent film used the previous one's antagonist and exploration of character as a blueprint for how to handle the next, allowing Po to progress at a natural pace that hints at the type of journey he's gonna take without giving too much away. He's always getting better, and by extension, so are the people around him, seeing as they inform who he is just as much as the villains. Granted, not everyone's as fleshed out, most of the Furious Five are still waiting for their Tiger spotlight, but for how much the trilogy juggles, it's super cohesive in giving the cast new obstacles that gradually develop Po and those around him, while making sure each test is harder than the last. It's one of the best there is at keeping the protagonist on his toes through increasingly deadly circumstances, even if, when it comes to the rule of escalating tension, How to Train Your Dragon 2 does it better. Ooh man, I don't think there's ever been a sequel that was so grand, and that's a real achievement considering how big the original was. Like, it was Vikings going to war with dragons and learning to ride them to fight off an even bigger dragon. It was the most cinematic metal shit you could think of, and somehow, with that as the benchmark for what people expected, 2 came around and said, yeah, loving what you're doing here, movie, great job. One thing, or rather, it should be 2 things, as in, let's take this big fucking dragon, multiply it by 2, and have them fight. Boom. Not enough? How about this time, to spice it up, we get the Dragon Vikings to fight other Dragon Vikings that control one of the big fucking dragons and do it through fear. Double boom. Still on the fence? What if we took the main guy's dead mom, made her alive, and she's been saving dragons the whole time? Triple boom. Still unsatisfied? You're one greedy son of a bitch, but I respect it. Alright, first time Best Boy Hiccup lost his leg, had to make a real sacrifice that fundamentally changed how he did things but made him stronger? What if, after his parents reunite, making you think his family will finally be whole again as badass dragon-riding barbarians, the evil goth Viking forces Hiccup's dragon to kill his dad right in front of him, and his dad doesn't come back? Yeah. You want weight? You want drama? You want scope? You want to cry like a little fucking baby? It's there. This movie does all that it possibly can to be as big and cinematic and impactful as a PG rating will let them, and it's backed up by serious consequences that don't get reversed. It goes way beyond plain spectacle, and believe me, that probably would have been enough. With all the unique dragon designs and set pieces and overall amazing atmosphere, this could have just been a big silly dragon war with a dash of heart thrown in. But that sacrifice of Hiccup's dad is an emotional gut punch that really helps deliver how much bigger of a threat the new antagonist is. Whereas before, the big bad was literally a big alpha dragon, this creature that didn't have the capacity to be reasoned with, 2 gives us a person who theoretically should have the capacity for reason, but actively rejects it, giving him a distinction that makes for a world of difference intimidation-wise. As far as personalities go, he isn't the strongest. That's probably my one major complaint with the film, but his simplicity is meant to mirror the alpha dragon with the added factor of malicious human thought, so I think he gets a pass. He does the job he's meant to do, and makes for a good counter to Hiccup's idealism, providing yet another instance of a character's old views that helped them before being challenged. It's an effective choice for showing the stakes are higher than anything we've seen before, and more than that, it also ties back into the other rules by respecting what the previous films established while doing its own thing, and continually developing themes the first set up. No wonder it's such a prominent trait of their sequel villains. It embodies all the rules their best sequels follow. And I guess that explains why the villain in Kung Fu Panda 4, the Chameleon, is so terrible. She embodies how 4 takes these rules that have served the studio so well and chucks them into the vast reaches of space. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's start from the beginning with how the film handles respecting the source material without relying on it, which is admittedly an odd thing to talk about here, since it isn't exactly reliant on the older films, despite what the trailers might lead you to believe, but it sure as hell isn't respectful. See, a big selling point of this film, as showcased by the trailer, was that this new villain, the Chameleon, could steal the abilities of Poe's previous foes, taking their shape and gaining all of their same skills. Her whole identity hinges on being able to replicate legacy characters, so you'd think those enemies would be treated with a level of respect by the narrative, knowing how important they were. But 4 doesn't do this. If anything, they're treated like Fortnite skins, just random pop culture references with no bearing on what they're appearing in, having their likenesses stolen and soullessly replicated for the sake of Soy Jack pointing meme. Aside from Tai Lung, they didn't even bother getting their old voice actors back. They might as well have been locked in cages for the whole film. Oh wait, they were. Literally. Huh. And to think one of those guys is a tactical genius. Who knew the whole time all Poe needed to do was lock him in a cage? Looking real foolish right now, bud. And speaking of Poe, he's somehow treated with less regard than the villains purely to, 1, prop up Awkwafina's character as cool and confident instead of annoying and stereotypically sassy like she is, and 2, break the rule of developing themes and characters by downplaying all he's been through, acting as if he's still stupid and insecure about his place in the world, since that's what he needs to be for this film to work. A petulant dumbass who can't fathom the possibility of giving up the role of Dragon Warrior. It's as if the writers looked at Poe's final speech from the 3rd film and only picked up on the ending line of "I am the Dragon Warrior," when it's what he said before that that matters. How he struggled to understand who he is for so long, but realizes he doesn't have to define himself by one label, as a person's identity isn't decided by where they came from or what they've been, but how they view themselves with all of that in mind. It goes beyond black and white. Him calling himself the Dragon Warrior is just meant as an all-encompassing term. The title itself is meaningless. Poe shouldn't have any problem giving it up with how confident he should be in himself. But the film treats it like he's unable to accept change, a facet of himself he directly addressed in the 3rd movie. It's total thematic whiplash going from there to here, as Poe's journey across this film essentially amounts to him learning a simplified version of the same lesson. That change is not bad. Riveting stuff. I'm so on the edge of my seat here, I could just fall off and give myself an excuse not to watch it. But sarcasm aside, this really does unravel Poe's character so he can redevelop with the added hyphen that this time he's passing the torch, showing blatantly that it's more interested in setting up another trilogy with Awkwafina than keeping consistent with the current franchise. After all, change is good, so we should forget the old guys and accept the new generic face with open arms. It's why the continuity is treated so disposably, why Shifu, Poe's mentor, is barely here, why the members of the Furious Five are sent off screen until the end. It's so they can get rid of the first generation so they can start fresh with a new batch. And I can't accept it for the reason that, disregarding how the new Dragon Warriors got almost no likable traits or distinct features, I don't feel like I'm entering a new age of bigger stories. Everything about this is so small in scope and theme. It reminds me of the Kung Fu Panda TV show more than anything. Though, honestly, that's a bit insulting to the show, since it has multiple fun villains with better screen presence than the Chameleon, who doesn't set herself apart in any significant way, physically or otherwise. The film tries to make a dichotomy between her and Poe where he's willing to change and she isn't despite her powers, ooh, irony. But if I'm keeping it real, that theme is hardly there at all, since she gets so little screen time to do or say anything noteworthy. If it weren't for Poe having a dream about her midway through the film, she wouldn't have shown up for, and I timed this, 29 minutes of an 86-minute feature. And she wasn't even mentioned in the first 20. And in the time she does appear, she goes down with 2 hits. It's a super anticlimactic fight for a super anticlimactic villain who doesn't put any physical or mental strain on either of the leads. She has no personality, provides no challenge, stacks no paper, gets no bitches. So why is she treated with such reverence? To gaslight us? Cause it doesn't work. You can't circumvent actual relevance and meaning with empty platitudes. It takes actions, or at the very least statements, to give her any level of fear or something, but she doesn't have it. She's nothing, and so is this film. It's pointless. You're not discovering anything new about the characters, getting any new interesting ones, giving them room to expand their horizons. At best, 4 gives us a new setting, Juniper City, but it's glossed over about as quickly as any other scene. So in the end, it doesn't fill out the world, it just highlights how empty it is. And unlike most bad Dreamworks films, this isn't a result of trying new things and failing. There's no greater ambition or attempt at anything here. From a writing standpoint, it's about as safe as you could go for a Kung Fu Panda film, but that's just it. Safe and Kung Fu Panda are not words that mix well together. If Kung Fu Panda were a safe franchise, it wouldn't have had the balls to cover generational trauma, what chasing a never-ending ambition can do to someone, the value of not defining yourself by bits and pieces but the whole of your person. A Kung Fu Panda movie being safe is antithetical to why people love it in the first place, and that goes double for Dreamworks as a whole. Did anyone think a movie about a fat panda voiced by Jack Black learning Kung Fu could get so dark? That dragons fighting Vikings could have such emotional depth? That a sequel to a spin-off of a fairy tale satire could be so thoughtful? Of course not. You'd expect absolute crap from start to end, but Dreamworks took those chances to prove everyone wrong. They made those bets, and yeah, they didn't always succeed. That's what happens when you experiment. You fall down, you get laughed at. People dismiss you and your goals, but that's what makes it all the more impressive when you finally triumph. To know that you went through all that trial and error and came out the other side. That's what makes Dreamworks so likable. They have the balls to take risks, but you can't get a home run if you never step up to the plate, and that's why Kung Fu Panda 4 caused the reaction it did. Not just for being bad, but being something Dreamworks never was before. Predictable. What more is there to say? I've been Just Stop. You've been Kung Fu Fighting. Thanks for watching.